On a freezing Montana dawn, a scarred farmer opened his cabin door to a sight no man could believe. A towering black stallion standing on his porch, not to attack, but to beg. At the stallion's hooves lay a dying foal, fragile as breath itself. What began as one man's reluctant choice to help soon spiraled into a battle of trust, survival, and sacrifice that would tear open his past and bind him to the wild forever. The first thud sounded like a slow heartbeat in the ground, one, then another, traveling up the porch posts and into the bones of the old farmhouse. Samuel Hayes set his tin mug down and listened. Bitterroot Valley, Montana, held its breath the way late autumn does when the first talk of snow rides the wind. Corn stalks scraped each other in the dark. A draft moved through the kitchen and lifted the corner of an unpaid notice that had slid from the mantel. The bank's thick paper, the kind an attorney uses when he wants to sound larger than the table he sits behind. Samuel pressed the notice flat with 2 fingers and said nothing to the empty room. The hoofbeats halted. Not at the gate, not by the trough, on the boards of the porch itself. He reached the door and paused, feeling the familiar ache in his left leg. The old cavalry wound that changed the way he climbed stairs, the way he slept, the way winter crept into him sooner than it used to. He pulled back the iron latch. The door came open with a soft complaint, like an old man getting up from a chair. Fog sat low over the yard, silvering the fence rails and turning the cottonwood into a smudge of charcoal. Between Samuel and the night stood a horse as black as a burned match. It filled the doorway, taller than any animal he'd seen outside of a circus poster, muscles working along its shoulders in slow tidal ripples. The eyes were not red or wild. They were the color of amber held to a fire, lit from within, steady, terrible in their quiet. For a beat, the two of them stared, farmer and legend, the space between them full of their breath. Samuel's first instinct came from a different lifetime, hands reaching for a rifle that no longer lived by the door, shoulders tightening for noise and dust. But the great horse did not rear or strike. It lowered its head, and something small shifted at its fetlocks. A foal lay there, folded in on itself like a bundle of wet cloth. Frost clung to the lashes. The sides moved in a shallow stutter, then paused in a way that frightened the air out of Samuel's chest. The foal's coat, the color of ash rubbed into leather, was matted along one hind leg, where blood had dried into a stiff halo. The little mouth opened and closed, as if chewing the fog. Samuel realized his hand was on the door frame, squeezing hard enough to find splinters. Beyond the yard, the valley stretched into a low, pale glow. Lewiston Road, where the stage rattled on Wednesdays. The general store with the ledger that remembered every promise you made about your mortgage and your feed bill. The insurance man who nodded politely when he wrote down that your barn roof required attention. And the cool voice of the bank letter that came last week, reminding him his grace period had the life of a match flame. He thought, absurdly, they will never believe this. The black horse stamped once. Not a warning. A declaration. The sound carried through the fog and across the field, and was swallowed by the cottonwoods. Samuel took a single step backward, then stopped himself. The foal's chest hitched. That was all it took. A breath might be leaving, and a hand might be what kept it from going. "Easy," he said, though he wasn't sure which creature he was speaking to. His voice sounded unfamiliar, as if he'd found it at the bottom of a cold stream. He moved the way a man crosses a frozen river, testing each inch. The porch board creaked and the black horse's ears flicked. Samuel opened his empty palms, a gesture that had once meant truce on muddy roads where banners drooped from rain. "I'm not here to take," he said. "I'm here to try." The horse's head dipped a fraction, enough to show him the line of the foal's neck. Samuel crouched. The foal's skin was shock cold. He could feel the shiver inside the small body like the rattle of dry seeds in a paper envelope. "Stay," he whispered to the breath itself. "Stay with us." He rose, went inside, and brought back the things his hands remembered without asking his head. An old wool blanket, a shallow basin, the last of the honey in a chipped jar his wife once used for tea. He warmed water on the stove and found a clean cloth to lay over the basin's rim. He did not think about the letter by the mantel, or the way the rooms held quiet like old bread holds smell. He did not think about retirement or the far-off math of men who wore city boots. He thought about how you coax warmth into a fading thing without scaring it away. "Let me near," he told the horse as he set the blanket on the porch boards. The great head hovered, close enough that he felt the heat and the slow machine of breath. The eyes held. The horse did not move. Samuel lifted the foal. It weighed almost nothing, the way an empty bucket fools you until the handle bites. The foal's legs dangled, and when the blanket took him, the small hooves scraped at the wool, not in panic, but in the weak rehearsal of life. Samuel tucked the corners the way he had once wrapped his daughter when the fever shook her. He kept the memory like a hot coal he could not throw and could not drop. The honey dissolved into the warm water and made a swirl the color of late afternoon. He dipped a spoon and touched the tip to the foal's lip. "Just a taste," he said. The first drop slid down the chin and darkened the fur. He tried again, slower, the way you tip medicine into a mouth that has forgotten what it means to swallow. The foal's tongue twitched. A thread of sound left, Samuel's throat. Not a word exactly, but the sound a man makes when a door opens on a room he thought was gone forever. Outside the porch rail, the horse circled once, carefully, the way a sentinel makes sure all the corners have stayed where they belong. When the head came back to the level of the blanket, Samuel saw it more clearly. Not a monster, not a ghost, but an animal carrying a weight no animal should have to carry. The requirement of trust. "Nightfall," Samuel said, trying the word on his tongue. "If you'll have it, that's your name." He said it the way some men say a prayer, quiet, specific, for a single ear. Nightfall's ears tipped forward. A slow breath rumbled through the massive chest. The fog lifted enough for the moon to paint edges on things. Sam's hands, the knotted grain of the porch, the foam of breath that feathered from the foal's nose. Somewhere far off, a coyote made the sound that always struck him as a laugh you hear after a story that wasn't funny. He offered another spoonful. Then another. The second drop stayed. The third almost did. Samuel's back began to ache. But it was the good ache, the kind that says you are giving more than you expected to, and some part of you is grateful for the chance. He rubbed the foal's chest in small circles and felt warmth begin to nibble at the cold. "You're stubborn, aren't you?" he said, and almost smiled. "Good. Stubborn keeps a roof on a house. Stubborn is how a man pays the note when the work is thin." He did not look at the fields where the corn stood ragged, or at the bent gutter he kept meaning to mend before the ice came down like a hammer. He did not think of home insurance, or the neighbors' talk about premiums and lightning strikes. All his care belonged to a single set of lungs and a pair of eyes that had not yet decided whether to open. Time changed shape on that porch. The clock over the stove ticked only when he remembered it. Nightfall's shadow moved an inch, then another, across the floorboards. The foal's breaths evened into a rhythm just steady enough to make hope hurt. When the wind shifted, he smelled the clean iron of the horse and the sweet mineral trace of the valley. The cottonwood loosened a leaf, and it came down spinning, as if unsure whether it was fall yet, or still a late piece of summer caught in a pocket. The memory rose in him without permission. The touch of a small hand on his cheek. The question his daughter had asked when the fever ran high. "Will you stay till morning?" And his promise, which had been true until morning, refused to be what it had always been. He shut his eyes just long enough to ask forgiveness of a room that no longer had a crib in it. When he opened them, Nightfall was looking at him, not with pity, with understanding, which is worse and better all at once. "Morning," Samuel said to the foal, though dawn was hours away. He tilted the spoon and held his breath. The foal's throat worked. The swallow was so small he would have missed it if his fingers hadn't felt the tremor. He laughed then, the sound tearing a little on its way out, and Nightfall answered with a low note that sounded like thunder a long way off. The cold deepened toward midnight, and Samuel fetched the oil lamp and set it near the blanket for a circle of warmth. He shrugged on his coat and laid his rough hand along the foal's neck. The pulse under the skin felt like a bird at rest. He believed he could sit this way until the law found him, until winter sealed the eaves, until every letter in the world turned to smoke. A shadow moved beyond the fence line, just a deer, or the idea of one. The valley's noises kept their distance. Samuel thought of the town, the way fear begins as a joke and ends with men who drink too fast, speaking too loud. He pictured Jonas Reed's hat brim loose with sweat, and the marshal's careful eyes, and the clerk at the store who held a pencil like a gavel. He imagined how a tail grows legs and a tail. A black horse becomes a blacker threat, and the rest takes care of itself. He bent closer to the foal. "You don't owe the world your story," he murmured. "You owe it your breath, and I'll stand watch for that." He eased the blanket tighter and let the lamp lift a little heat into the small tent of wool. Nightfall's muzzle came down until it hovered above Samuel's shoulder. The warm breath rolled across the back of his neck, and he had the odd sense that the horse could smell the whole of his life. The forge smoke from his years as a blacksmith, the lather and leather of cavalry days, the lavender water his wife had used on Sunday, the sad starch of the starched shirt he wore to 2 graves. He did not move. He let the breath be what it was, an allowance. "Thank you," he said to the air. It felt right to say. Hours gathered themselves and set down quietly. When the foal's breathing grew shallow again, Samuel tipped the spoon and waited, and tried not to let panic knock things from his hands. The swallow came late, but it came. He felt his shoulders ease. The lamp's flame wavered once and caught its balance. Near dawn, the fog thinned to show a river of gray along the eastern ridge. The cold had that strange brightness it gets when the sky is about to be the color of milk. Samuel's knees complained when he stood. He rubbed them with both hands, then leaned his weight to stretch the scar in his thigh until the ache changed from knife to rope. Nightfall followed the motion with those ember eyes. "Morning's coming," Samuel told the horse. "That's the bargain I made a long time ago. I stay till morning." He looked down at the foal. The little chest rose and fell with a rhythm that was still fragile, but no longer wild. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding since the first hoofbeat hit the porch. He thought of coffee, and of how the first swallow on a hard day tastes like permission. He thought of calling out to the empty house, the way he sometimes did, asking a question to no one about feed or weather. Instead, he said the thing the next hour required. "I need help," Samuel whispered, the words barely louder than the steam that curled from the lamp glass. "I can hold the line, but I can't mend what I don't know. I'll fetch someone who does." He met Nightfall's gaze and nodded once, as if answering a command he had finally decided to obey. Then he turned toward the yard, where his old mare dozed near the fence, and the first thread of light began unspooling between the hills, light enough at last to point the way to town. The road to town was still cloaked in pale gray when Samuel Hayes drew the saddle tight across his old mare's ribs. The horse blew a tired breath, fog rolling from her nostrils, as if she too questioned the wisdom of traveling before dawn. Samuel's left leg throbbed with the familiar ache of cold and scar tissue, but he pressed his boot into the stirrup and pulled himself up, jaw clenched against the complaint of joints that had grown older than the rest of him. Behind him, on the porch, the oil lamp still glowed faintly. Under the circle of light, the foal lay bundled in wool, chest rising in uncertain rhythm, while the great black stallion, Nightfall, stood sentinel, its massive body a wall of shadow and promise. Samuel guided the mare into the rutted lane, each hoof striking with a hollow sound that carried into the stillness. The Bitterroot Valley spread around him, cornstalks bent and brittle, fields stripped of color, cottonwoods skeletal against the horizon. This was land that punished softness. Men spoke of yield and mortgage rates, of crop insurance and freight costs, as if the soil listened. But Samuel knew the earth only answered to sweat and patience, and even then, it often answered with silence. His life here had become the reflection of that soil, unyielding, scarred, carrying more absence than presence. He remembered when he first came west after the war, his left leg bound, his spirit drained. He had chosen this valley because no one else had wanted it. The fields were rocky, the winds harsh, the winters long. Yet for him, it was refuge, a place where the silence did not demand conversation, where no one asked why he walked alone. He built the cabin with his own hands, hammering nails through grief and exhaustion until the house stood like a stubborn act of will. For years, he believed he had buried the past beneath the boards, but now, with a single night on the porch, the past had clawed its way back. The foal's fragile breaths replayed in his ears with every hoofbeat of his mare. Each stumble of memory brought him to the fever of his daughter, the way her skin burned under his palm, the whispered promise he made that he could not keep. When the grave swallowed her, he thought it had swallowed all reason to care again. Yet one look at that small, trembling chest last night had unraveled the barricades he'd built. A creature not his own had asked him to stay until morning. And he had. That frightened him more than the stallion's burning eyes. As the first lanterns of town came into view, Samuel felt the shift of another kind of weight, the human one. Townspeople spoke quick, sharp words that spread faster than winter fire. They had already whispered about his debts, about the sagging roof and the unplowed field. What would they say of a black horse the size of a house, appearing at his farm, leaving a half-dead foal. Fear thrived in such places. Fear could raise the price of feed, drive men to sell, and send rifles hunting. He knew the pattern. First a rumor, then a story, then a verdict. He dismounted by the edge of Main Street, where the wooden awnings sagged under the night's frost. A dog barked once and then retreated, sensing the unease in the air. Samuel tied the mare and limped across the boardwalk toward the small clapboard building where a single lantern burned, a doctor's office that had been ignored by many because its owner was not the man they expected. Clara Whitmore had come from Boston with nothing but a satchel and a conviction that medicine was not bound by gender. She had mended hands crushed by wagon wheels, stitched the brows of drunk ranchers after fights, and set the leg of a child who had fallen from a hayloft. Yet the town still eyed her with suspicion, whispering that no lady had business with sutures and scalpels. Samuel rapped once on the door. A pause. Then the sound of footsteps across a wooden floor. Clara opened, hair braided loosely, sleeves rolled above her elbows. She carried the air of someone who did not wait for approval to be given. "Mr. Hayes," she said, tilting her head at the sight of his weather-worn coat, the dust on his boots. "You're out early." "There's something you need to see," Samuel replied, his voice hoarse from the night. He searched for words, but none seemed large enough. "It's a foal, hurt bad, brought to my porch in the middle of the night, by its sire." Clara frowned, not in disbelief, but in calculation. Sires don't usually carry their young to a doorstep. This one did. Samuel's hand tightened on the brim of his hat. And it wasn't any ordinary stallion. It was black, near the size of a draft horse, eyes like— He stopped, shook his head. "You'll think me touched." Her gaze softened a fraction. "I've seen worse things than a man desperate enough to believe in miracles. Show me." Within minutes, she had gathered her satchel, cinched the straps across her shoulders, and locked the door behind her. The town remained hushed, the kind of hush that carries questions unasked. A sign in the store window across the street offered new rates on grain insurance, bold letters painted over glass that reflected their figures as they passed. Samuel thought of the foal shivering, under the wool blanket, and pushed forward. By the time they reached the edge of the valley, dawn had pulled a pale stripe across the ridges. Clara rode a chestnut mare with sure hooves, her back straight despite the biting wind. Samuel kept silent for most of the journey, his jaw tight, his thoughts circling the foal like nightfall circling the porch. Clara studied him at intervals, seeing a man scarred more deeply than his limp explained. She said nothing, but her presence beside him was steadier than any words. When at last the cabin came into view, the oil lamp still glowed in the dim light. Samuel's chest clenched. He half feared the porch would be empty, that the foal's chest had stilled, that nightfall had vanished into fog like a story he had only dreamed. But as they rode closer, the sight froze him in the saddle. Nightfall still stood at the rail, unmoving, massive, a sentinel carved from shadow. And beneath its watch, the foal remained curled in the blanket, its breath faint but visible. Clara slid from her horse, eyes narrowing as she took in the size of nightfall. "Good Lord," she whispered. "That's no tale." Samuel dismounted, his hands unsteady. "I told you," he said quietly, though the words were more to himself than to her. He stepped toward the porch, feeling the ground tremble beneath each hoofbeat of the black stallion. Nightfall's head turned, eyes burning, but it did not strike. Clara set her satchel down, kneeling beside the foal, her hands already moving with the precision of one who knew the thin line between breath and silence. Samuel held his own breath, watching as the woman and the horse measured each other in the space of a heartbeat. The valley around them was waking. The cottonwoods rustled, a crow called once from a distant fence post. Yet for Samuel, time had narrowed to this moment. A woman kneeling, a foal fading, and a stallion entrusting his world to the hands of strangers. He felt the earth tilt, and with it, the weight of his own solitude. Something had shifted forever. The porch smelled of oil lamp smoke and frost when Samuel guided Clara toward the bundled foal. Nightfall stood over them, shoulders arched high, his breath clouding like smoke from a forge. Clara knelt, rolling up her sleeves, hands practiced and steady despite the sheer presence of the animal looming above. Samuel kept close, his weight shifting uneasily on his bad leg, ready to throw himself forward if the stallion struck. But Nightfall did not. His amber eyes locked on Clara's movements, unblinking, as though memorizing every gesture. Clara touched the foal's neck with the back of her hand. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Pulse is faint. He's dangerously cold. She eased her fingers along the foal's ribs, pausing at the hind leg where blood had dried in a stiff mask. This wound is deep, but not fresh. Infection's begun. She reached into her satchel and drew out a small vial. I'll need fire to sterilize and more warmth than this lamp can give. Samuel ducked inside the cabin, returning with a bundle of straw and the thicker of 2 wool blankets. He spread the straw near the lamplight, his motions clumsy from fatigue, then lowered himself beside Clara. Together they shifted the foal onto the bed of straw, the colt's body lighter than Samuel expected. Its head lolled against his arm, and the brief weight made him shiver, the echo of carrying his own child from crib to sickbed. He forced the thought away, focusing only on the foal's shallow breaths. Nightfall's hooves struck once against the porch boards, thunder in wood. Samuel raised both palms. Easy now, he murmured. She's here to help. His voice cracked, but the stallion's head lowered a fraction, the ears flicking forward as if conceding. Clara glanced at Samuel, then back to the horse, a spark of awe in her gaze. I've never seen anything like this, she whispered. He's not just guarding, he's watching as though he understands. Samuel didn't answer. He was too busy holding the foal's jaw still, while Clara coaxed drops of honey water past its lips. At first the liquid slid away, darkening the straw beneath. But after several attempts, the colt's throat moved. One swallow, then another. Samuel felt the faint tremor beneath his fingertips and nearly laughed out loud. There you go, he whispered. That's it. Stay with us. The black stallion gave a low rumble, a sound that vibrated through Samuel's chest. It was not a threat. It was approval. Samuel glanced up, meeting the horse's gaze, and for the first time since the war, he felt something loosen inside him. He realized the bond forming here was not made of rope or rein, but of trust. A pact born in silence, sealed in the pale light of dawn. Hours stretched thin. Clara cleaned the wound with strips of cloth soaked in whiskey, her brow furrowed in concentration. Samuel held the colt steady, murmuring reassurance in a rasp he hadn't used in years. Nightfall circled the porch, slow and deliberate, each pass a warning to the world beyond the fence. The only sound inside that circle was the scratch of Clara's tools, the soft hum of the lamp, and the fragile rhythm of a foal's breathing. As the sun climbed higher, color returned faintly to the colt's lips. Its ears twitched at Samuel's voice, a small but undeniable response. Clara sat back, wiping sweat from her forehead with the sleeve of her coat. "He has a chance now," she said softly. "But he'll need tending day and night." Samuel's eyes stung with sudden relief. He looked at the foal, then at nightfall, and spoke the promise aloud, more to himself than anyone else. "I'll see it through. I won't turn away." The words seemed to settle in the air. Nightfall's stance shifted, his great head lowering until his muzzle brushed the straw near Samuel's hand. For a long heartbeat, man and soul, stallion remained locked in that fragile stillness. It was absurd, unspoken, and yet Samuel understood it clearly. The horse was entrusting him with its child, and he had accepted. The porch grew quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavier than noise. Beyond the cottonwoods, Bitterroot Valley stretched endless and indifferent. But on that porch, between the scarred farmer, the weary doctor, the foal clinging to life, and the wild stallion who had crossed the unthinkable, a covenant had been made. Samuel exhaled slowly, pressing a rough hand against the colt's chest, feeling the faint flutter within. "We'll make it, little one," he murmured. "You're not alone now." Nightfall's ears flicked at the sound. His eyes burned in the morning light, steady, unyielding. And in that gaze, Samuel found something he had not known in years. Faith, quiet, and demanding, like the land itself. The day leaned toward dusk when Clara Whitmore unpacked her satchel on Samuel's worn table. The leather was scuffed, its straps patched more than once, but every vial and bandage inside was neatly arranged, a soldier's kit disguised as a doctor's bag. She worked with a quiet authority, laying out tools by the glow of the lamp. Samuel leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching her with a mixture of gratitude and unease. His cabin had not seen another soul linger so long in years, and now here was this woman filling it with the smell of spirits, herbs, and resolve. Through the open doorway, nightfall remained in the yard, dark against the falling light. The stallion's presence was impossible to ignore. Every so often, his rumble drifted in like thunder, low but steady, a reminder that he was both guardian and judge. Samuel had no doubt that if Clara made one wrong move, the beast would know. Yet Clara's hands never faltered. She worked over the foal with an efficiency born of stubborn belief that no life, human or animal, was too small to fight for. "Most men out here won't call me until they've lost hope," Clara said after a long silence, her eyes fixed on the wound she was cleaning. "They laugh when they hear a woman doctor has set up in Bitterroot, but their laughter dies when their child is burning with fever." She paused, her tone softer. "You didn't laugh, Samuel. You came." Samuel shifted his weight, staring at the lines of age carved into his hands. "I didn't come because of faith," he admitted. "I came because the little one wouldn't have lasted without someone who knew more than me. That's all." His words were rough, but Clara caught the crack beneath them, the sound of a man who had carried too many graves. She tied the last bandage with firm fingers, then sat back on her heels, sighing. "That's enough for tonight. He'll need more than what I can do in a single visit. He'll need tending, warmth, and time." Her gaze met Samuel's. "That means you." He nodded once, a motion as small as it was heavy. His chest tightened as he looked at the foal, now breathing with slightly more rhythm. He had made promises before, to soldiers bleeding in mud, to a child fading under fever, and too many had broken in his hands. Yet something about the way the foal's chest rose, fragile but insistent, demanded he try again. The cabin grew quiet, shadows lengthening across the floorboards. Clara remained seated, her satchel half-packed, her face drawn in thought. Samuel studied her in the flickering light. She was younger than she first appeared, yet her eyes carried the weight of someone who had spent years fighting battles without bullets, battles of ridicule, dismissal, and isolation. He recognized that weight. It mirrored his own. "Why come here?" he asked suddenly, surprising even himself. "This valley isn't kind. It swallows most who try." Clara looked up, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she said, "Because people here need me, whether they admit it or not. And because I'd rather live where every saved breath matters than die in a city where no one remembers your name." She smiled faintly, but it was the kind of smile meant more for herself than for him. Outside, nightfall shifted, his silhouette cutting sharp lines against the last stripe of sunset. The stallion lowered his head, snorting once, as if to punctuate the unspoken words inside the cabin. Samuel glanced toward the door, then back to Clara. "He doesn't trust easily," he murmured. "Yet he brought the foal to me. That means something." "It means he saw something in you," Clara replied. "Maybe more than you see in yourself." Samuel had no answer for that. He only moved closer to the foal, adjusting the blanket, his calloused hands unexpectedly gentle. The foal stirred, a faint sound escaping its throat, not quite a whimper, but enough to make Samuel's breath catch. He smoothed its small mane and whispered, "Rest easy now. You're safe." Nightfall's rumble carried in once more, softer this time, like an echo of Samuel's promise. Clara watched silently, sensing that she had stepped into something larger than any diagnosis or treatment. She packed her tools carefully, closed the satchel, and stood. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said. "He won't be out of danger for a long while." Samuel followed her to the door, his limp pronounced after hours of kneeling. The valley outside was sinking into blue-gray dusk. He saw her mount her horse, the satchel hanging against her side like an extra limb. "Thank you," he said quietly, words he had not spoken to anyone in longer than he cared to admit. Clara tipped her chin. "Don't thank me yet. Thank me if he makes it." With that, she guided her mare down the dirt track, her figure dissolving into fog. Samuel turned back toward the cabin. Nightfall still stood guard, head high, eyes glowing faintly in the twilight. Samuel felt the unspoken agreement settle deeper between them. He had taken on the burden, and the stallion would hold him to it. The farmer eased onto the porch steps, his body heavy, but his mind sharper than it had been in years. The foal shifted inside, letting out a faint sigh. Samuel tilted his face toward the sky, where the first stars had appeared, and whispered, "We'll see this through, you and I." The night answered with silence, but the kind that carried promise rather than emptiness. For the first time in a long while, Samuel didn't fear the hours ahead. The Bitterroot Valley darkened quickly, swallowing the last of the light until only the oil lamp on Samuel's porch kept the cold at bay. Clara had returned to town, promising to come back at first light, leaving Samuel alone with the foal and the massive shadow of nightfall. The house creaked under the weight of the wind, and the silence between gusts carried its own heaviness. Samuel settled himself beside the small body wrapped in blankets, his scarred hands resting gently on its ribs, as if his touch alone might keep the fragile rhythm of life steady. Hours stretched in uneven lengths. The foal's breath rattled shallow and uncertain. Each pause felt like the edge of a cliff, each weak exhale a reprieve. Samuel leaned closer again and again, lowering his ear to the tiny muzzle, desperate to feel the faintest whisper of air. When none came, panic gripped him, and he would rub the colt's chest with rough urgency, murmuring, "Stay with me. Just one more." Sometimes it worked, sometimes not, but the rhythm always returned, thin as a thread of spider silk, holding them both captive. Nightfall never moved far. The stallion's enormous form lingered at the edge of the porch. Head lowered, amber eyes burning with an intensity that cut through the night. Each time the foal's chest faltered, Nightfall's hooves stamped once, a sound so deep it rattled through Samuel's bones. It was not impatience. It was demand. An order to fight, as if the beast refused to allow death to come while it still stood guard. The hours became a war Samuel knew too well. He remembered crouching in mud years ago, pressing his palms against torn flesh, whispering promises to boys too young to shave. He remembered the smell of smoke and iron, the sound of cannon fire echoing like an angry sky. Now the battlefield was his porch, the weapon a tin spoon, the enemy the quiet pull of death. And the words spilling from his mouth were the same as then. "Hold on. Stay with me. Don't leave just yet." Cold settled into his limbs, but he did not rise. He fed the full drops of honey water, coaxing with a voice hoarse from use. Sweat dampened his temples despite the chill. He pressed against the colt's ribs, feeling for the flutter of a heart that seemed always on the verge of surrender. The minutes blurred into hours, his mind half in the present, half dragged into trenches of memory. The porch lamp sputtered once, and for a terrible instant he thought it would go out, leaving them in the dark. But the flame caught again, as if refusing to abandon them. At some point after midnight, the valley grew unnervingly still. No wind stirred the cottonwoods. No coyote called from the ridges. Samuel realized that even the crickets had gone silent, as if the land itself were waiting. In that oppressive quiet, the foal's weak breathing seemed louder than cannon fire. Samuel bent lower, pressing his forehead against the colt's damp mane, and whispered, "Not this time. I won't lose another. You hear me, little one? Not you." Nightfall shifted closer, the boards groaning beneath his weight. Samuel did not flinch. The stallion's muzzle hovered inches above his shoulder, the warmth of its breath mingling with his own. It was a strange communion, man and beast bent over the fragile spark of life between them. For a moment, Samuel felt as though his vow had been heard, not just by the foal, but by the immense presence watching over them both. The night dragged on, unyielding. Samuel's back ached, his leg burned, and exhaustion clawed at him, yet he refused to let his eyes close. Every rise and fall of the foal's chest became his measure of time. When the breaths quickened like a trapped bird, he murmured calm until they steadied. When they faltered into silence, he begged, rubbed, pressed, refusing to yield. Hours became endless, but he fought them one heartbeat at a time. At last, just before dawn, the foal stirred. Its ear flicked faintly, then twitched again, as if responding to the rhythm of Samuel's rough voice. A shiver traveled through its small body, and Samuel caught the subtle shift, the difference between fading and holding on. His throat tightened. He dipped the spoon once more, let a drop fall onto the tongue, and this time the swallow came easier. Relief surged through him so sharp he nearly wept. The sky outside was paling, the first suggestion of morning brushing the ridges. Samuel sagged back against the wall, tears stinging his eyes. The foal was not safe. Not yet. But it had chosen, for now, to fight. And that was enough. Nightfall lifted his head, exhaling a long rumble that rolled like distant thunder. Samuel looked up and met the stallion's gaze, and in that burning amber light, he saw the same promise he had made. We will not give up. The night had been longer than any battle Samuel had fought, yet in its final hour, it had delivered what war never had. Hope. The first light of morning crept slow over the bitterroot ridges, turning the frost on the fence rails to silver shards. Samuel sat hunched on the porch, every bone in his body aching, every thought fixed on the fragile body bundled at his side. The night had nearly undone him. Hours of shallow breaths, hours of bargaining with silence. But now the sky was softening, and in that softness, something shifted. The foal stirred faintly beneath the wool. Its jaw twitched once, then again, and Samuel felt the fragile spark of a swallow beneath his fingers. He held the tin spoon with a trembling hand, tilted a drop of honey water past its lips, and this time, the liquid did not spill away. The throat worked. The foal swallowed. It was the smallest of victories, but to Samuel, it broke the world open. His chest hitched with a sound that might have been laughter, might have been a sob. He pressed a hand against his forehead, whispering, "Good, little one. That's it. Don't quit now." His words fogged in the chill air, but they felt warmer than any fire. Nightfall lowered his massive head, amber eyes fixed on the colt, and let out a sound Samuel had not heard before, a low, resonant whinny, not threat, not grief, but something closer to gratitude. Samuel blinked hard against tears he had thought long dried. In that moment, with dawn spilling pale gold across the valley, it was as if he had been given back a piece of himself he thought the war and the graves had stolen forever. He remembered his daughter's hand clutching his finger in fever, remembered how her breath had failed despite his every prayer. Now, with this foal, he felt the universe had granted him a second chance at keeping a promise. The colt shifted again, weak but determined. Its small hooves pressed against the straw, not strong enough to rise, but no longer limp with surrender. Samuel steadied it, murmuring encouragement in the same tone he had once used to coax a mule across river ice. "Easy now. You've done enough for one night. Just breathe. That's all I ask. Just breathe." From the yard, Nightfall's silhouette loomed vast against the lightening sky. The stallion stamped once, then stood utterly still, as if acknowledging the moment. Samuel felt the weight of that silent approval settle in his chest. This was no ordinary bond. It was not ownership, not command. It was a pact. The horse had chosen to trust him, and Samuel had answered by keeping life alive until the morning. Exhaustion weighed on him like an anchor. His back ached from hours crouched over straw, his bad legs screamed with fire, and his eyes burned from watching for every rise and fall of a small chest. Yet he could not bring himself to close them. He was afraid that if he looked away, even for a moment, the fragile miracle would vanish. So he sat there, cradling the warmth he had coaxed into existence as the valley woke around them. The cottonwoods shook loose their first leaves. A crow called from a distant ridge. Far off, the sound of a wagon wheel groaned against the frozen ground. The world was moving again, but Samuel's porch felt like the center of it all, a small circle where breath and hope had decided to remain. He lifted his gaze to the ridges, saw the horizon catch fire with dawn, and whispered, "We made it. We held on." When Clara rode up an hour later, her chestnut mare lathered with frost, she found Samuel slumped but still awake, his coat dusted with straw. She dismounted, quickly her eyes sharp as she bent to the foal. Samuel couldn't help the hoarse laugh that escaped him. "He swallowed," he said, voice cracking. "Just at dawn." He swallowed. Clara touched the foal gently, her expression softening as she felt the steadier rhythm beneath its ribs. "Then he's chosen to fight," she replied quietly. She glanced at Samuel, seeing the lines etched deeper on his face, and added, "And so have you." For a moment, the three of them, farmer, doctor, stallion, stood in a silence that was no longer heavy with dread, but full of fragile hope. The valley wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of thawing earth. Nightfall lifted his head toward the hills, his mane catching the light, and Samuel thought he looked less like a shadow and more like a herald of something new. The foal gave a faint, sighing sound, settling deeper into the straw. Samuel laid his hand across its back, rough and scarred, yet gentle. He met Clara's gaze and allowed himself a truth he had not spoken in years. Maybe we've all been waiting for this morning." The doctor didn't answer. She only nodded, her eyes glistening in the dawn. Behind them, Nightfall stood unmoving, his watch not yet ended, as if to say the fight was far from over. But for the first time in longer than Samuel could measure, the day began not with loss, but with the taste of honey and the promise of survival. Dry Hollow's only tavern leaned heavy against the wind that evening, lantern light spilling from its windows onto mud-thick streets. Inside, heat from the stove and the haze of tobacco smoke mixed with the sharper tang of spilled whiskey. Ranch hands crowded the long tables, boots on benches, cards slapped against wood, laughter too loud for the stories it accompanied. But beneath the laughter lived something else. Fear stretched thin into bravado. Jonas Reed sat at the center, his broad shoulders filling more space than the chair allowed. He was a man who carried money in his pockets and anger in his jaw, and both gave him authority in this valley. His herds dotted the lower slopes, more cattle than most families would see in a lifetime, and he viewed anything unbranded as a threat. Tonight, that threat had taken the shape of a story that passed from mouth to mouth, growing heavier with each retelling. A black horse the size of a barn, prowling the valley, eyes burning like coals, bringing ruin in its wake. "It's not rumor," one man insisted, slamming his cup down. "My boy saw prints by the creek wider than his boots. If that monster comes near my herd, there won't be a calf left standing." Jonas leaned forward, his voice cutting through the clamor. "That beast doesn't belong here. Wild stock's one thing, but this? It's a devil horse. If we let it roam, it'll scatter our cattle, spook our mares, and put us all in the poorhouse." He paused, letting the silence hang before he added, "The law might look the other way for a while, but I won't. I'll see it put down before it wrecks what we've built." The words landed like sparks on dry tinder. Men who had been grumbling in half-belief straightened, nodding. A few pounded the table. The sound filled the room like the rising of a storm. No one mentioned that the black horse had hurt no man, stolen no stock, broken no fence. Fear did not need evidence. It needed only an image, and Jonas had given them one. At the back of the tavern, Samuel Hayes stood with his flour sack, listening. He had come only for supplies, but the moment he stepped through the door, he felt the weight of eyes and whispers. Now, hearing Jonas fan the crowd's fire, his stomach clenched with dread. He thought of Nightfall standing sentinel outside his cabin, thought of the foal whose breath had just begun to steady, and felt the ground shift beneath him. He wanted to speak, to tell them what he had seen on his porch. A stallion not of rage but of plea, a creature that had laid its trust at his feet. He wanted to tell them about the foal, fragile and gray, alive only because of a single drop of honey swallowed at dawn. But he knew better. This room had no patience for truth that asked for compassion. Fear had already been chosen as the easier story. Jonas raised his glass, whiskey sloshing. "If the marshal won't act, I'll call the cavalry myself. They'll bring rifles enough to drop a beast that size." The room erupted in agreement, the sound of men convincing themselves they were right because they were loud. Samuel's fists clenched until his knuckles burned white. Every word felt like a blade pressed against his chest. He left without a sound, pushing through the swinging doors into the cold. The street lay empty but for a dog nosing the gutter. His mare waited by the post, ears flicking. He mounted slowly, his leg protesting, and turned toward the valley. Behind him, the tavern's laughter roared again, a cruel echo in the night. As he rode home, the stars overhead were sharp as nails. Each hoofbeat carried the weight of decision. Tell no one, speak to no one. Carry this burden alone. He thought of Clara, of her steady hands and quiet defiance, and wondered if even she could shift a tide already turning against the stallion. He thought of Nightfall, how the horse had lowered its head and allowed a man near its child. And he thought of the promise he had whispered into dawn. "We'll make it. We'll hold on." The road stretched black before him, the cottonwoods whispering above. Samuel whispered back, though no one heard, "They'll come for you. They'll come for both of you. But I won't let them have you." Back at the cabin, the lamp still glowed faintly. Nightfall's silhouette cut against the starlight, vast and immovable, guarding the straw bed where the foal slept. Samuel dismounted, his chest aching with a mixture of fear and resolve. He laid a hand against the porch post, steadying himself, and made a vow into the cold air. "Whatever storm they raise, we'll weather it together." The foal stirred, letting out a soft sigh, as if in answer. Nightfall's eyes caught the starlight, burning steady, unblinking. And in their depths, Samuel thought he saw the reflection of fire. Not the fire that destroyed, but the kind that endured, even against a room full of men eager to snuff it out. The frost was still clinging to the porch rails when Samuel heard the measured rhythm of hooves along the lane. He stepped outside, the morning cold biting through his coat, and saw Marshal Owens riding up slow, the reins loose in one hand. The marshal was not a man easily rattled. Gray at the temples, broad through the chest, his presence carried the authority of someone who had spent decades keeping quarrels from turning into funerals. But today, his face was drawn, and the way he sat in the saddle told Samuel that he had come with words heavy enough to bend a man's back. Owens dismounted with a grunt, boots crunching on the frozen ground. His gaze swept to the yard. The foal bundled in straw just inside the open barn door. Clara crouched near it, checking the bandages, and beyond them, the looming figure of Nightfall, half shadow in the morning light. The stallion's head rose high, eyes burning with silent intensity, and Owens froze for a fraction, the reins taut in his hand. "So the stories are true," he muttered, almost to himself. "Bigger than any Mustang I've seen." Samuel's jaw tightened. "He hasn't harmed a soul. He brought the colt here because it was dying." Owens lifted his eyes to Samuel's, and in them was no disbelief, only the weight of law. "I don't doubt your word, but truth doesn't always matter when fear is louder." He shifted, rubbing a gloved hand over his chin. "Jonas Reed stirred up half the town last night, said the beast will ruin their herds." Men nodded. Some swore they'd saddle up with rifles before week's end. Clara rose from the straw, wiping her hands on a cloth. Her face was pale, but steady. "So you came to warn us?" The marshal gave a slow nod. "The law says unbranded stock is wild, and wild can be taken or put down if it threatens livelihood. Trouble is, the law never thought of this." He gestured toward Nightfall, who stamped once and blew a heavy breath, as if he understood every word. "If enough men cry hazard, the territorial office will listen. And when the government sends men to deal with a beast, they don't bring ropes, they bring rifles." The words fell heavy into the morning air. Samuel felt them in his bones the way he had once felt the whistle of shells overhead. An inevitable storm you could not outshout. He glanced toward the foal, its breathing steadier now, but still frail. The idea of strangers tearing through this valley, of Nightfall collapsing under a hail of bullets, made his stomach twist. Clara broke the silence first. "And what about you, Marshal? What will you do?" Owens met her eyes, then Samuel's. "I keep the peace, but peace won't last long if folks believe their cattle are in danger. I've no quarrel with you, Sam, but you'd best think what you aim to do before it's decided for you." He tugged his hat low, mounted again, and with a weary click of his tongue, rode back toward town, leaving only hoofprints pressed deep in the frost. Samuel remained standing by the porch rail, his fists tightening until the wood dug into his palms. He could still hear the marshal's words, ringing like a verdict. Clara stepped beside him, her voice low but firm. "He's right. They'll come." Samuel turned his eyes to Nightfall, who had not moved, the great stallion's body tense but unwavering. In its eyes he read something beyond fear. Expectation. Trust had been given, and with it, a responsibility heavier than any burden he had carried before. He thought of the battles he had fought, the comrades he had buried, the graves that still lived in his nightmares. Then he thought of the colt, whose tiny heartbeat had steadied in his hands, and the choice became clear. "I won't let them touch him," Samuel said at last, his voice a rasp of iron and resolve. "Not him. Not the colt." Clara studied him a moment, then nodded. "Then we'd better be ready. Fear can move faster than truth." The foal stirred in the straw, letting out a faint sound, and Samuel's shoulders eased just slightly. He crouched, adjusting the blanket, his scarred hands gentle against the fragile body. Above him, Nightfall lowered his head, nostrils flaring as his breath mingled with Samuel's. For a heartbeat, the world shrank to that small circle of trust. Man, beast, and fragile life bound together. But beyond the cottonwoods, the valley carried the echo of boots and rifles not yet gathered, but soon to come. Samuel felt it in the air, in the way the morning seemed thinner than usual, as though the horizon itself braced for storm. He whispered to the foal, "We'll find a way." The words were not a promise yet, but they would have to become one. That night, Samuel sat alone on the porch steps, a lantern flickering at his side. The valley lay quiet, but the quiet did not bring peace. Marshal Owen's words still pressed against him, heavy as an iron yoke. "They'll come with rifles, Sam." He stared at the foal resting in the straw bed, its breathing steadier now, its chest rising and falling in a rhythm that felt almost normal. And near the barn, Nightfall stood tall in the moonlight, his silhouette cut sharp against the ridgeline, mane drifting in the cold wind. The stallion seemed carved out of the night itself, watching, waiting, as though he too sensed the storm gathering beyond the hills. Samuel's mind circled restlessly. He had fought battles before, on muddy fields, against men who spoke in different tongues but bled the same color. Yet this was different. This was not a fight. He could meet with steel or fire. He had no army now, no flag, no cause but one: to keep a fragile life safe. The colt had swallowed honey at dawn, had chosen to fight, and that choice bound Samuel in ways he could not ignore. Inside the cabin, Clara dozed in a chair, her satchel close by. She had stayed after the marshal's visit, refusing to leave Samuel to face the night alone. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, casting the room in soft, uncertain light. Her presence was a quiet reassurance, yet Samuel knew even her skill could not shield them from the force of fear once it took root in men's hearts. He rose stiffly, limping to the doorway. Nightfall turned his head toward him, ears flicking. Samuel whispered into the darkness, "They'll come for you. And when they do, I won't be able to stop them here." The words caught in his throat, but saying them aloud made their truth undeniable. His thoughts turned to a story he had once heard on a winter night long ago, around a fire shared with a Shoshone guide. The man had spoken of a hidden valley beyond the Bitterroot Ridges, a place where wild horses thrived away from the eyes of men. Steep cliffs guarded it, cottonwoods sheltered its streams, and no rancher's brand ever touched its herds. Samuel had dismissed the tale then as myth, but now, in the shadow of Jonas Reed's growing anger, the story returned like a map drawn in memory. Perhaps it was legend. Perhaps it was real. Either way, it was the only chance he could see. He sat back down, staring at the foal. The colt twitched in its sleep, legs kicking weakly as if dreaming of running. Samuel reached forward, laying a calloused hand gently against its side. "You deserve more than this," he murmured. "More than fences, more than bullets waiting to find you." His voice dropped lower, breaking. "I couldn't save them before, but maybe I can save you." The hours crept past, each one heavier than the last. Samuel felt the weight of his own solitude pressing harder than ever. He had buried family, comrades, even himself, in ways he had never admitted. But this time, something fragile and fierce had asked him not to give in. The foal's breath, the stallion's watchful eyes, Clara's steadfast courage. They had all woven themselves into a net that refused to let him fall back into silence. By the time dawn bled pale over the horizon, Samuel had made his decision. He would leave the ranch behind. The fields he had plowed, the roof he had hammered with his own hands, even the soil that held the bones of his yesterdays, he would abandon them all if it meant carrying the colt to safety. When Clara stirred awake, she found Samuel already gathering supplies: blankets, sacks of grain, a canteen, and the old army knife that had traveled with him through too many battles. She blinked at him, still half in sleep. "What are you doing?" "Preparing," Samuel answered simply. We can't stay here. Jonas will stir them up, and the marshal won't be able to hold them back. The only way to keep him safe, he nodded toward the foal, is to take him where men won't follow. Clara frowned, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. And where is that? Samuel hesitated, then told her of the hidden valley, of the Shoshone tale. She listened without interrupting, her brow furrowed, and when he finished, she exhaled slowly. A valley few dare to reach, she said softly. It sounds like a place meant for stories. Maybe so, Samuel admitted, but stories are all we have left. I'd rather chase one than sit here waiting for a bullet. Clara studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Then I'll help you. He'll need more care on the road than you can manage alone. For the first time in years, Samuel felt the faint stir of something he had nearly forgotten. Partnership. Not the kind forged in war, but in quiet defiance against despair. He met her gaze, a flicker of gratitude in his tired eyes. Then we ride at dawn tomorrow. Outside, nightfall stamped once, sending a tremor through the earth. Samuel turned his gaze to the stallion and thought he saw recognition there, as though the horse understood. Perhaps he did. The farmer returned to his work, hands steady now with purpose. As the colt stirred awake, blinking weakly at the light, Samuel bent close and whispered, Tomorrow, we begin again. Tomorrow, we go where they can't follow. The foal let out a faint sound, almost like a sigh of agreement. Nightfall's eyes glowed steady in the morning haze, and Samuel felt the covenant seal itself tighter around him. The decision was made. There would be no turning back. The wagon groaned like an old man's bones as Samuel guided it onto the narrow track that wound toward the Bitterroot ridges. Dawn had broken pale and thin, spilling its light across the frost-crusted earth. Every wheel turn seemed louder than it should, echoing against the emptiness of the valley. Behind him, in a bed of straw lined with wool blankets, the foal shifted, its body still weak, but no longer limp with surrender. Clara sat beside it, steadying the colt whenever the wagon lurched, her eyes sharp against the cold. And trailing always at their flank, nightfall moved like a storm contained, each step deliberate, each breath a plume of white in the morning air. The land was already hardening into winter. Snow had gathered in patches along the gullies, and ice clung stubborn to the edges of streams. The hills rose jagged ahead, gray teeth biting into the sky, and Samuel felt the weight of every mile. His leg ached with the strain of bracing the wagon, but he gritted his teeth, unwilling to show weakness. He had made the decision to leave. His land, his home, his past, and now each turn of the wheel carved that choice deeper into stone. By midday, the road narrowed, hemmed in by cliffs. Loose rock skittered under the mare's hooves, and Samuel's hands tightened on the reins. Steady, he murmured, his voice low and even. He had led troops through mountain passes more treacherous than this, but never with something so fragile in his care. Every bump, every jolt, sent his heart hammering, not for his own bones, but for the foal's. Clara leaned close over the straw bed, whispering words Samuel couldn't hear. Her hand stroked the foal's neck, calming it when the wagon rattled too violently. For the first time since he'd known her, Samuel noticed a gentleness beneath the iron resolve. She wasn't only fighting for life with medicine and skill. She was offering the colt the one thing it understood more than bandages: presence. Samuel swallowed hard. He had once known that kind of presence, in the arms of a wife who had whispered to their fevered child. Memory clawed at him, but he pushed it down, focusing on the road. The cold sharpened as the day wore on. Wind funneled through the gullies, carrying the sting of snow. Samuel pulled his coat tighter and glanced back at the stallion. Nightfall did not falter. The beast moved with the patience of stone, never straying, never letting the wagon out of sight. Once, when the mare stumbled on a patch of ice, Nightfall surged forward, shouldering close, as if ready to bear the wagon's weight himself. Samuel caught his breath. "You're not just following," he whispered. "You're guarding." They stopped briefly at a stream, its surface cracked with thin ice. Samuel watered the mare, filled the canteens, and rubbed warmth into his leg before climbing back onto the seat. Clara took the chance to check the foal's bandages, frowning at the swelling, but relieved to see no fresh blood. "He's holding," she said softly, almost as if reassuring herself. Samuel only nodded, though inside, relief spread through him like fire. By late afternoon, the climb grew harsher. The wagon wheels slipped in mud that had thawed under the weak sun, then froze again in the shadow of the cliffs. Samuel coaxed the mare forward, sweat soaking her flanks, steam rising with every breath. Nightfall pressed close, his massive frame steady as a wall against the buffeting wind. More than once, Samuel caught the stallion's eyes on him, burning, unblinking, as if weighing his resolve. The sun dropped fast behind the ridges, leaving the world in blue shadow. Snow began to fall, first a whisper, then a steady curtain that blurred the trail ahead. Clara pulled the blanket tighter around the foal, shielding its frail body from the flakes. Samuel hunched into his coat, gripping the reins until his knuckles ached. The cold bit deep, but he refused to stop. Stopping meant doubt, and doubt was death. When at last they crested a rise, Samuel pulled the wagon to a halt. Below stretched a narrow valley, silvered with snow, the cottonwoods lining its creek, bowing under the weight of white. For a moment, the sight stole his breath. It was not the hidden valley the Shoshone had spoken of, not yet, but it was a step closer, a reminder that such places could exist. He turned to Clara. Her cheeks were raw from wind, her eyes red-rimmed from watching the foal, but she managed a small nod. Nightfall came to stand at the wagon's side, his breath clouding the twilight. Samuel looked at him, then down at the colt nestled in straw. The journey was only beginning, and already the hills had tested them. But they were still moving, still holding on. He laid a hand on the mare's damp neck and whispered, "Tomorrow we climb higher." The foal stirred faintly, lifting its head just enough to nuzzle Clara's hand. Samuel's chest tightened. Even in the heart of snowbound hills, fragile life still answered. And that, more than anything, gave him strength to press forward. The snow had thickened by the second night in the hills, falling in sheets that muffled the wagon's creaks and turned the trail into a narrow scar beneath white silence. Samuel's shoulders burned from holding the reins steady, his bad leg stiff as iron. Clara sat huddled in the back, the foal against her lap, her cloak wrapped around both of them to shield against the cold. Nightfall moved alongside, his great hooves sinking deep into drifts, his breath rolling like smoke in the air. It might have been peaceful, almost holy, if not for the sound that came drifting up the gulch behind them, a baying chorus that did not belong to wolves. Samuel felt the hair rise on his neck. He knew that sound. Hounds. He pulled the mare to a halt, listening. The voices carried closer, echoing through the stone walls of the canyon, joined by the crack of whips and the shouts of men. Clara's eyes widened as she caught the sound too. "Jonas," she whispered. Samuel's jaw clenched. He had hoped Jonas Reed would keep to threats and whiskey, but the rancher had wasted no time. He'd loosed men and dogs into the hills, determined to find the stallion, to prove the monster tale true. And Samuel knew men like Jonas. They didn't chase for justice, only for spectacle. The hounds came faster now, their howls rising in fevered pitch. The foal stirred, frightened, pressing its nose into Clara's side. Nightfall stopped dead, ears sharp, muscles rippling like coiled rope. The stallion's head turned toward the sound, and from deep in his chest came a roar so low it vibrated the snow beneath Samuel's boots. "Samuel!" Clara hissed, gripping the foal tighter. "What do we do?" He scanned the trail ahead. Narrow, hemmed by cliffs, no room to push the wagon faster. His mare could not outrun hounds weighted with cart and cargo. He knew the choice before he wanted to speak it. "We stand," he said simply, "and we pray they break before we do." The first shapes appeared out of the storm, dark figures on horseback, dogs lunging in front, their eyes wild with scent. Jonas was not among them, but Samuel recognized the Reed brand on their coats. Men with rifles slung across their backs, faces red with cold and greed. The hounds lunged forward, teeth flashing. Nightfall surged into motion with a scream that split the frozen air. The stallion reared, striking the ground with his hooves, snow exploding under the weight. Dogs skidded back, whining, circling, too frenzied to retreat but too fearful to close in. One rider raised his rifle, but Samuel's own voice thundered across the gulch. "Lower it, or I swear by God, you'll answer to me before you answer to him." For a heartbeat, the canyon froze in tableau. Stallion towering like a black mountain, dogs cowering, men gripping reins tighter than they'd meant to. Clara's breath came in ragged bursts as she shielded the foal, her eyes darting between Samuel and the advancing riders. Then one dog broke, snapping at Nightfall's leg. The stallion lashed out with terrifying precision, a single hoof sending the animal sprawling into snow. The others scattered, baying but unwilling to test him further. The riders cursed, spurring their horses forward, but the narrow trail hemmed them in. Samuel stood firm, his bad leg braced, hand on the wagon rail, his voice cutting through wind and fury. "This is no devil horse. He's guarding his young. You fire on him, and you fire on me." The words struck harder than he expected. Perhaps it was the way Samuel's voice carried. A soldier's command, scarred but unyielding. Perhaps it was the sight of Nightfall, not savage but resolute, holding the line like a commander at the front. Whatever the reason, the men faltered. One cursed under his breath, yanked his dog back by the collar, and turned his horse. Another spat into the snow and followed. Within moments, the baying retreated down the gulch, leaving only the hiss of falling flakes. Samuel sagged against the wagon, breath ragged, heart hammering. Clara's hand touched his shoulder briefly, a wordless tether pulling him back to center. The foal shivered once, then stilled against her, its eyes closing in fragile trust. Nightfall stood above them, chest heaving, mane plastered with snow, his eyes glowing as though he'd swallowed the storm itself. "They'll be back," Clara murmured. Samuel nodded grimly. "Aye, but now they know what waits for them." He looked at Nightfall, awe mingling with resolve. "And so do I." He climbed back onto the wagon, snapping the reins. The mare lurched forward, wheels biting into frozen ruts. Nightfall fell into step beside them. Unbroken, unyielding, his presence no longer just guardian, but warrior. Samuel set his jaw against the wind. The valley ahead was still far, but they were moving. And after tonight, he no longer doubted that they would make it there. Not alone, but together. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the hills wrapped in silence, the snow glinting faintly under a pale band of sky. Samuel guided the weary mare up the last stretch of the pass, his hands stiff with cold, his leg trembling with each jolt of the wagon. Clara kept the foal close, murmuring words of comfort as its head rested weakly against her lap. Nightfall followed at their flank, massive and black against the new snow, his breath rising in heavy clouds. Samuel had almost given up believing the tale of the valley, but as they crested the ridge, the land opened, and what lay below stole the air from his chest. The valley stretched wide and green despite winter's grasp, as though the snow itself had chosen to pause at its borders. Cottonwoods lined a clear stream that cut silver through meadows, their branches swaying in a breeze gentler than the gales that had hounded them for days. Herds of deer grazed at the far edge, lifting their heads briefly at the newcomers before settling again. It was as if the place had been waiting, hidden from men and rifles, a sanctuary untouched. Samuel halted the wagon at the ridge, staring down as if afraid the vision would vanish if he moved too quickly. Clara gasped softly beside him, her hand still resting on the foal. "It's real," she whispered. "It's truly here." For a long moment, Samuel could not speak. The stories he had carried like half-forgotten songs now stood solid before him, carved into earth and water. The decision he had wrestled with night after night seemed suddenly less like a gamble and more like a calling. He flicked the reins gently, guiding the wagon down the slope into the valley's heart. Nightfall surged ahead, his hooves striking the earth with a rhythm that felt older than memory. When they reached the meadow floor, Samuel halted the wagon near the stream. He climbed down stiffly, his leg nearly buckling from fatigue, and helped Clara lift the foal onto the soft grass. The colt blinked at the sudden brightness, its ears twitching, its breath visible but steady. Samuel spread a blanket beneath it, adjusting the bandages with hands that trembled more from awe than exhaustion. Nightfall approached, lowering his massive head to the colt. He inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring, and for a moment the world stilled. Samuel held his breath, afraid the stallion might reclaim its young and vanish into the wild herds that surely roamed here. But Nightfall did not move to take him away. Instead, he stood close, a shadow of protection, his eyes flicking once to Samuel in a gaze that felt less like threat and more like recognition. Clara knelt beside the foal, her hair tumbling loose from the wind, her hands gentle as she adjusted the colt's position. "Here," she said softly, offering Samuel a flask of warm broth she had heated over a quick fire. "Let's see if he'll take more than honey today." Together they coaxed small sips into the colt's mouth. To their astonishment, he swallowed greedily, a faint strength flickering in his eyes. Clara's smile was weary but radiant. "He's fighting harder now." Samuel sat back on his heels, staring at the foal, then at the stallion looming above. He thought of all he had left behind. The cabin leaning into the wind, the half-plowed fields, the graves he never visited enough. He realized none of it mattered as much as this fragile life, this trust offered by a wild beast, this valley that promised a future unscarred by fear. As the sun rose higher, the valley revealed itself in full. A flock of birds lifted from the cottonwoods, scattering across the sky. The stream whispered against its banks, carrying the clean scent of melted snow. Samuel closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. For the first time in years, he felt not like a man running from loss, but like someone who had arrived where he was meant to be. Clara settled beside him, brushing the snow from her cloak. "Do you think they'll find us here?" she asked quietly. Samuel opened his eyes, looking out across the ridges that walled the valley like guardians. "If this place has hidden itself for this long," he said, "maybe it can hide us too." He glanced at Nightfall, who lifted his head high, mane rippling in the wind. The stallion looked every bit the sovereign of this sanctuary, a creature of myth made flesh. Samuel felt a slow smile tug at his lips. Or maybe he'll make sure of it. The foal shifted, letting out a faint nicker that startled them both. Samuel laughed softly, the sound rusty but genuine, and Clara's answering smile lit her tired face. For a moment, the valley seemed to hold its breath with them, as if acknowledging the fragile triumph of survival. Samuel reached forward, resting his rough hand on the foal's back. "Welcome home," he whispered. And for the first time in years, the words felt true. The valley's silence was unlike any Samuel had ever known. It was not the silence of empty land or of grief, but the deep stillness of a place untouched, as though time itself bent around it. He sat in the grass near the stream, his boots damp, his body sore from days of travel. Clara was across from him, coaxing the foal to take careful steps. The colt wobbled, knees buckling, then straightened again, determination flickering in its dark eyes. Nightfall watched from a distance, his massive frame outlined against the rising cliffs, ears pricked, body taut with unreadable purpose. For hours they lingered in that suspended world. Clara moved with patience, guiding the foal in small circles, murmuring encouragement. Samuel found himself unable to look away, his chest aching with something he could not name. He had seen men fight to their last breath, had heard the broken prayers of fathers begging for sons to live. But this fight was different. It was not against an enemy, not against men, but against frailty itself. And somehow, in every faltering step, Samuel felt a piece of himself rising too. By midday, the colt managed 3 unsteady strides before collapsing back onto the blanket. Clara laughed softly, pride in her voice. "He's choosing to taunt. Stay with us," she said. "He wants to fight." Samuel nodded, but his eyes drifted to the stallion above them. Nightfall had not moved, yet Samuel felt the weight of his gaze with every heartbeat. The stallion had carried the foal to his porch, had guarded them through nights of terror, and had endured the chase of hounds. Now, here in this valley, his role seemed to shift. He was not demanding anymore. He was waiting. As dusk began to fall, Samuel carried the foal to the cart they had pulled down into the meadow. He untied the rope that looped gently around the colt's neck, the same rope he had used to steady it through the journey. His fingers lingered on the knot, then released it, letting the rope fall away into the grass. Clara watched him, her brow furrowed. "What are you doing?" "Giving him a choice," Samuel answered. His voice was low, rough with something close to fear. He set the colt down, stepped back, and stood still. "He's not mine to keep. If he belongs with Nightfall, he'll go. If he stays, then it will be by his own will." The meadow seemed to hold its breath. The colt blinked at Samuel, then turned toward the stallion. With a tremor in its legs, it began to walk, halting steps through the grass. Nightfall lowered his head, waiting. When the colt reached him, their muzzles touched briefly, a spark of recognition passing between them. Samuel's chest tightened until it hurt. This was the moment, the truth of every promise and every night spent keeping breath alive. Clara's hand brushed Samuel's arm. He didn't look at her. Couldn't. He watched as the colt lingered beside Nightfall, trembling, torn between blood and bond. The stallion exhaled a low rumble, a sound that seemed to come from the bones of the earth. Then, to Samuel's astonishment, the colt turned back. Its legs wobbled, its body leaned, but it walked, straight toward him. It pressed its muzzle into Samuel's coat, weak but sure. Samuel dropped to his knees, arms wrapping around the fragile body, his forehead against its mane. His breath broke into a laugh that was almost a sob. "God help me," he whispered. "You chose me." From the cliffs, Nightfall raised his head, eyes glinting in the dying light. For a heartbeat, stallion and man met across the meadow. There was no anger, no grief, only solemn acknowledgement. Samuel felt it in his bones. This was not a surrender, but a covenant. Nightfall had given his child to human hands, not as a gift to own, but as a trust to honor. The colt settled against him, eyes fluttering closed, its breath warm against his chest. Clara knelt beside them, her smile faint, but filled with something Samuel could not quite face. Hope. The stream murmured nearby, cottonwoods rustling in the evening breeze, and above them the stallion turned slowly, climbing the slope into shadow, his massive form fading into the high ridges. Samuel held the colt tighter, tears slipping unbidden down his face for, the first time since the war, he felt not like a man abandoned by life, but chosen by something wild, something fierce, something that still believed in his hands. The valley darkened around them, stars beginning to pierce the sky. Samuel whispered into the colt's ear, "You're free. You chose this path, and so did I." The colt sighed softly, as if in answer. Nightfall's distant silhouette paused once on the ridge, then vanished beyond sight. Yet Samuel knew he had not gone far. The bond was not broken. It had only changed shape. And in that quiet, Samuel felt it, the burden of freedom and the weight of being chosen. The snow in Bitterroot Valley had begun to soften, its crust broken by threads of grass pushing toward light. Samuel's wagon rolled slow along the trail that led them back toward his cabin, each mile carrying the weight of change. The foal, now steadier on its legs, rode quietly in the bed lined with straw, while Clara sat beside it, her hand resting protectively on its back. Samuel held the reins loosely, his eyes drifting often to the cliffs behind them. He knew Nightfall was still there. He could feel it in the way the air seemed charged, in the silence between the wind gusts, in the tremor that sometimes rose from the earth like the beat of a hidden drum. By the time the cabin's roof came into view, leaning against the sky as it always had, Samuel felt the ache of returning. The porch boards sagged, the fences leaned, the fields lay barren under a film of frost. Yet somehow, after all they had endured, the place no longer looked like a ruin. It looked like a beginning. He dismounted stiffly, his bad leg complaining, and helped Clara carry the foal down. The colt tottered, unsteady but eager, its small hooves sinking into the familiar earth. Samuel watched with a swelling pride he hadn't felt since holding his daughter's first steps long ago. That night, He sat on the porch rocker while Clara prepared broth inside. The foal, curled in straw beneath the cottonwood, lifted its head now and then, ears pricking to the sounds of the valley. Samuel sipped coffee gone cold, his gaze drifting to the ridges. And there, etched against the horizon, he saw him. Nightfall, black and immense, a shadow crowned with fire from the setting sun. The stallion stood perfectly still, watching. Samuel rose slowly, hat in hand, as though acknowledging a figure carved into legend. Their eyes did not meet across a dozen paces, but across a gulf of understanding that no distance could erase. Samuel felt it like a hand pressed to his chest. Nightfall had not abandoned them, had not severed the bond. He was keeping watch. Clara stepped outside, drying her hands on her apron, and followed Samuel's gaze. Her breath caught softly. "He's still with us." Samuel nodded, the brim of his hat trembling in his fingers. "Not with us," he corrected, voice low, "but near enough. Close enough to remind me what was given." His eyes misted as he looked back at the colt, now nosing through straw with clumsy determination. "I swore I'd protect him, and that's a vow I'll not break." The stallion shifted slightly, tossing his mane, then turned his head toward the far ridge. The gesture was not farewell. It was assurance. A silent message carried in the lift of his neck, the patience in his stance. "You keep him. I'll keep watch." Samuel's throat tightened. He had fought wars, buried comrades, carried losses like stones in his pockets, yet never had he felt so seen, so trusted, as in that gaze from the mountain. When darkness fell, the stallion faded into shadow, his form dissolving into the landscape as though he had always belonged to it. Samuel remained standing long after, hat clutched at his side, his breath steaming in the night. Clara touched his shoulder lightly. "He'll come again," she whispered. Samuel gave a weary smile. "Aye, and when he does, he'll find us ready." He looked down at the foal nestled by the cottonwood, then back at the empty ridge where Nightfall had stood. For the first time since returning from war, Samuel felt not just needed, but chosen. The wind moved through the branches, carrying the faint scent of thawing earth. Samuel lowered himself back into the rocker, boots propped on the rail. The foal gave a soft, contented sigh in its sleep. He tipped his face toward the sky and whispered words only the night could hear. "I'll keep faith, old boy. As long as breath stays in me, I'll keep it." Spring came slow to Bitterroot Valley. The snow retreated inch by inch, exposing dark soil and stubborn shoots of grass that bent in the wind but refused to stay buried. Samuel Hayes sat on his porch, the rocker creaking under his weight, watching the foal, no longer fragile but still tender, stumble across the yard with a growing boldness. The colt had gained strength since those nights of desperate whispers, ribs hidden now beneath a sheen of muscle, eyes brighter with each dawn. He had even begun to test the fences, nosing at the gate, as though reminding Samuel that freedom still tugged at his blood. Clara visited often, her leather satchel always at her side, though the foal needed her less with each passing week. She checked bandages out of habit, measured the colt's breaths, but more often she stayed simply to sit beneath the cottonwood, letting silence do what medicine could not. Samuel found her presence a comfort he had not expected, a reminder that he no longer bore the weight alone. They spoke little of the town, but Samuel knew the fear had not fully died. Men still muttered about the black stallion, still glanced nervously at the ridges when driving their cattle. Yet none had dared return with rifles. Perhaps the hills had swallowed their courage. Perhaps nightfall's shadow had done the rest. One evening, as the sun bled red over the mountains, Samuel heard the sound he had come to wait for. A single hoof striking stone, then another, slow and deliberate. He rose from the rocker, hat in hand, and looked toward the ridge. There, against the sky, stood Nightfall. The stallion's mane streamed in the wind, his eyes glowed with the fire of fading light. For a long breath, man and beast regarded one another across the distance, and Samuel felt the weight of the vow that bound them. The foal, Ashen, as Samuel had named him, lifted his head from the straw, ears pricked. With a joyful whinny, he stumbled toward the fence, pressing his nose through the slats, calling to the shadow above. Nightfall answered with a deep rumble that rolled down the slope like thunder softened by distance. Samuel's throat tightened. He remembered the night the stallion had placed this life at his doorstep, remembered the trust offered in amber eyes. Now, months later, the stallion still returned, not to reclaim, not to haunt, but to remind. Samuel walked to the fence, his limp pronounced but his steps steady. He laid a hand on Ashen's neck, feeling the young strength under his skin, and whispered, "You're safe. You're home. And I've kept my word." The colt pressed against him, then looked back toward the ridge. For a moment Samuel feared he might leap the fence, vanish into the wild with his sire. But Ashen only gave a soft snort, then settled, choosing again to remain. Nightfall tossed his head once, as if satisfied, and turned slowly, fading into the dusk. Samuel stood long after the stallion was gone, the echo of hoofbeats lingering in the valley air. When he finally returned to the porch, Clara was waiting in the doorway, her eyes on him, her smile small but knowing. He sank into the rocker, exhaustion settling over him, but it was no longer the exhaustion of a man burdened. It was the weariness of one who had done what he promised and found peace in the keeping. As night fell, Samuel whispered into the dark, his words for no one and for everything. "Good night, old friend. The water's full, the gate stays open. You keep watch. I'll keep faith." The wind moved gently through the cottonwood. The colt sighed into his straw bed, and the valley held them in its quiet. A scarred farmer, a young horse, and a legend that lingered unseen in the hills, all bound not by rope or brand, but by a promise kept. And so under the wide Montana sky, a scarred farmer, a fragile foal, and a black stallion left behind more than a story. They left us with a promise that trust, once given, can change everything. If this touched your heart, drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments. I'd love to see how many of you felt the bond. Don't forget to subscribe, because more stories of humans and horses are waiting, and each one might be the one that stays with you forever.